The July sun descended upon Charleston's market square like a slab of hammered iron, pressing heat into the cobblestones until they shimmered, and Margaret Ashworth adjusted her mourning veil as she descended from the carriage, the humid air clinging to her skin beneath layers of dark fabric that propriety demanded of a widow. It was the summer of 1848, and Cornelius, her husband, had been buried only 8 months prior. Yet already the vultures had begun circling her cotton plantation as though it were carrion, waiting to be picked clean. The market teemed with activity, fruit sellers calling prices in sing-song voices, mules laden with grain sacks pushing stubbornly through crowds, the mingled scents of roasted peanuts and tobacco smoke drifting with salt air from the harbor several streets away. Gulls wheeled overhead with harsh cries, and somewhere a fiddler played a tune far too cheerful for the day Margaret was about to endure. If this story has captured your attention thus far, please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from tonight. It helps more than you might imagine. And now, back to Charleston. At the square's far end, where the plaza narrowed into a shadowed stone alley, a different silence prevailed, a shameful one, as though the entire city wished to pretend that corner didn't exist. There stood the slave auction, tucked away from elegant shop fronts and white-steepled churches, as if distance alone could cleanse the conscience of a town that depended entirely on the trade it refused to acknowledge directly. Margaret had never attended one. Cornelius had always handled such purchases himself, riding out for a week and returning with exhausted men and hollow-eyed women, never requiring her to witness the process that produced them. During the comfortable years of her marriage, she had told herself this arrangement was simply how the world operated, the way rain fell, cotton grew, and husbands managed the unpleasant business of running an estate. But now harvest approached. The overseer insisted she needed at least 2 strong hands to replace the 2 who had died of fever that spring, and the plantation's coffers were emptier than she had ever imagined possible. Her late husband's debts had been a bitter discovery layered upon grief, uncovered ledger by ledger in the weeks following his funeral. Each page revealed a small betrayal from a man she had trusted to manage what her father had built. She could afford only one. Approaching the group of chained men beneath a makeshift canvas awning, she scanned the line with a mixture of guilt and determination she couldn't yet name. Most kept their eyes down, shoulders slumped in gestures of defeat beaten into their very posture by the whip and the long road that had brought them here. A woman nearby wept silently, clutching a young child too young to understand why strangers kept examining her mother's arms and teeth. Margaret looked away from that scene, ashamed of her own relief that she wasn't there to buy a woman with a child, ashamed that relief was the feeling closest to hand. But at the end of the line stood a man who didn't fit the picture at all, tall, with skin the color of dark earth cured by years of sun, broad shoulders straining against the ragged shirt he'd been given for the sale. It wasn't his body that stopped Margaret's gaze, though his body was impossible not to notice. It was the way he held his head up, chin steady, eyes refusing to look away from anyone, buyer, trader, or fellow captive alike. When their eyes met across the crowded square, he didn't lower his gaze as the others did, as every instinct of self-preservation must have screamed at him to do. He watched her with a calm, unhurried intensity, almost as if she were the one being evaluated, weighed, priced. Something tightened in Margaret's chest in a way she hadn't felt in years, not since she was a girl, perhaps before marriage had taught her to keep her feelings folded neatly away like good linen. The auctioneer, a heavy-set man with sweat-soaking dark patches through his shirt, began selling the first men with a mechanical, high-pitched voice, announcing ages, strength, skills as though describing livestock at a county fair. Strong back. No visible defects. Good with mules. Buyers bid with absolute indifference, examining teeth and forearms and the calluses on palms before parting with their coins, haggling over a human life the way they might haggle over a plow horse. Margaret felt sick to her stomach, cold sweat gathering beneath her mourning veil despite the heat. But she forced herself to stay, reminding herself repeatedly that she needed this, that Ashworth Hollow needed this, that the land her father had built and left to Cornelius, and Cornelius had left to her, could not survive another failed harvest. When the tall man's turn came, the auctioneer hesitated, a small thing, barely noticeable, but Margaret caught it. "This is Josiah," he announced without his usual practiced enthusiasm. 29 years old, strong, knows farming, cotton and tobacco both. He paused, shifting his weight, clearly uncomfortable. Comes from a plantation in Georgia. Had 3 previous owners. A murmur ran through the gathered buyers, the particular murmur of men who had heard that phrase before and knew exactly what it implied. The opening bid was low, almost insulting for a man of that age and build, who by rights should have commanded a price near the top of the day's sale. Margaret frowned, confused by the low number and by how the other buyers seemed to be waiting for someone else to make the first mistake. On impulse, on something she couldn't have explained even to herself, she raised her gloved hand and offered a slightly higher amount. She waited, heart pounding beneath her corset. No one else bid. The other buyers looked at her with something like pity, the particular pity reserved for a woman who didn't understand the rules of a game everyone else had already learned to play. "Why so cheap?" she asked the trader afterward, once the papers were signed and the ink still wet, feeling the bitter weight of the word property settle on her tongue like a stone she would carry the rest of her life. The trader shrugged, avoiding her eyes as he counted the money into a leather pouch. "They say he's trouble, ma'am. Questions orders. His last owner sold him off 'cause he refused to whip another slave for stealing bread. Some folks say he brings bad luck to a household, unsettles the others, gets ideas in their heads. I'd advise you keep a close eye on him, and don't let him get too comfortable talking back." "I didn't ask for your advice on how to run my household," Margaret said more sharply than she intended, and walked away before he could answer, her heart still hammering from something that felt less like fear than like the opening of a door she hadn't known was sealed. On the road back to Ashworth Hollow, Josiah walked bound to the back of the wagon under the scorching afternoon sun, without complaint, without stumbling, his bare feet raising small clouds of red dust with every step. Margaret rode inside the carriage, but found herself watching him through the small rear window more often than she watched the road ahead, feeling a mixture of guilt and a fascination she didn't yet have a name for. Halfway through the journey, as the sun reached its cruelest point directly overhead, she ordered the carriage stopped and climbed down herself, carrying a canteen of water she'd filled before leaving town. "Ma'am, there's no need," the driver, a free black man named Amos who worked seasonally for hire, said, startled, half rising from his seat. "Let me decide what's needed," she answered with a firmness that surprised even herself, the words coming out before she'd fully thought them through. She approached Josiah, who stood as still and watchful as a man expecting a trap even in an act of kindness, and offered him the water. He looked at her for a long moment, his eyes moving from her face to the canteen and back, as if weighing whether accepting it might cost him more than refusing it. Finally, he drank, not desperately, the way a starving man might, but with a measured, deliberate dignity, taking only what he needed and no more, then handing the canteen back with both hands as though returning a borrowed object rather than surrendering a mercy. "Thank you, ma'am," he said in a clear, deep voice that didn't match the image the trader's warning had painted in her mind. In those 2 words, Margaret heard something she couldn't name then but would later recognize, looking back across everything that followed, as the beginning of everything. The rest of the journey passed in uncomfortable silence, broken only by the creak of wagon wheels and the distant call of a mockingbird somewhere in the pines. Margaret watched the landscape change as they left the port town behind, the neat brick storefronts giving way to scrubland, then to the first cotton fields, white bowls stretching toward the horizon under a sky bleached pale by the heat. She thought of her father, who had cleared this land with borrowed money and borrowed hope, who had always told her that the South's wealth was built on the backs of men and women he never once, in her hearing, called by name. Ashworth Hollow spread across 200 acres of red Carolina clay, ringed by loblolly pines that groaned when wind swept up from the coast, their needles whispering a sound Margaret had grown up thinking of as the plantation's own breathing. The main house stood at the top of a gentle rise, white columns holding up a wraparound porch, though the paint had begun to peel in places Cornelius had never gotten around to fixing. Margaret had grown up here, playing among the cotton rows as a girl in dresses never meant to survive an afternoon outdoors. And now she carried alone the weight of keeping the whole fragile enterprise alive. The overseer, a man named Garrett Dobbs, 50 years old and weathered by decades of work under a sun that had turned his skin the color and texture of old leather, waited for her in the yard when the wagon finally creaked to a halt. He looked at the single-bound figure being led down from the back of the cart, and his face did nothing to hide his disapproval. "Just one, Mrs. Ashworth," he said, not bothering with a greeting first. "I told you we needed at least 3 for the harvest, maybe 4 if we want to bring it in before the rains. It's what I could afford, Dobbs. It'll have to be enough." Dobbs circled Josiah slowly, the way a man might circle a horse he suspected of having a bad temperament, close enough to make a point of his authority, but careful not to get within reach of the still-bound hands. "Big, strong," he muttered half to himself, "but he's got a troublemaker's look about him. I know that stare, seen it before on men who end up costing more in trouble than they're worth in labor." "And what do you say to that?" Margaret asked, turning and addressing Josiah directly, a small thing, but she saw immediately how it landed, how the other workers scattered across the yard, feeding chickens or mending harness, all went very still, startled that she had spoken to the new man as a person, rather than simply discussing him as property in front of him, the way one discussed a mule's soundness in front of the mule. Josiah chose his words carefully, without bowing his head, without the practiced deference Margaret realized she had come to expect without ever noticing she expected it. "I say hard work doesn't scare me, ma'am. I've worked my whole life, since before I could carry a full sack on my own back. But unjust cruelty, that I won't accept in silence, not for myself and not for another man standing next to me. If that makes me trouble, then I suppose I am trouble." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by a hen clucking somewhere near the barn. Dobbs took a step forward, his hand drifting toward the coiled whip hanging from his belt, an old habit of a man used to answering insolence with immediate correction. "Enough," Margaret said, and the word came out with a firmness that surprised her, that seemed to surprise Dobbs even more. "No one gets punished on my land for answering a question that I myself asked him." Dobbs's jaw tightened, but he said nothing further, only spat to one side and turned to bark orders at 2 of the other workers about unloading feed sacks, a small performance of authority to salvage his pride in front of the yard. That night Margaret couldn't sleep. The big house felt emptier than ever, though truthfully Cornelius, 30 years her senior, chosen for her by a father anxious to secure his land's future rather than his daughter's happiness, had never filled it with much warmth, even when he was alive. Their marriage had been an arrangement between families, a transaction of land and surnames dressed up in a church ceremony and a wedding supper, not a union of souls. Now at 26, she was a widow alone in a house built for a family that had never quite materialized, fighting to save a plantation many of her neighbors expected, with a kind of eager anticipation she found distasteful, to watch her lose. She rose before dawn, unable to lie still any longer, and stepped out onto the upstairs balcony still in her nightgown, the morning air cool against her skin in a way that wouldn't last past sunrise. She watched the enslaved workers emerge from the row of cabins near the creek, shadows moving in the gray half-light before the sun cleared the pines. She recognized Josiah immediately among them, though she couldn't have said how, something in the set of his shoulders, perhaps, or simply the fact that she had been watching for him without admitting it to herself. While the others dragged their feet, shoulders bent under the weight of another day identical to the one before, he walked upright with firm, deliberate steps, as though he had somewhere important to be rather than simply another row of cotton to pick. Something in that image stayed with her for days, returning at odd moments, while she reviewed accounts, while she sat through the interminable silence of Sunday dinner alone at a table built for 8. Josiah's first days on the plantation were not easy. The other enslaved workers watched him with a mixture of curiosity and weary suspicion, all too aware of the rumors that had traveled ahead of him from the auction block, carried by the traders' careless words and the particular gossip networks that moved between plantations faster than any owner ever suspected. Some of the older hands whispered among themselves in the evenings that a man sold off by 3 separate owners must carry a real curse on him, not merely bad luck dressed up as principle. Others simply waited with the grim patience of people who had seen this pattern before to see how long it would take before he was whipped for insolence, as had apparently happened, or nearly happened, on plantations before this one. But Josiah gave no cause for punishment, not in any way Dobbs could point to directly. He worked in silence through those first weeks, with an efficiency that gradually began to quiet even the most skeptical doubts among the other workers. And in the evenings, in the low murmur of conversation that filled the cabins after the day's labor ended, word spread that this new man with the steady, unbroken gaze also knew how to listen, really listen, the way few people, free or enslaved, ever bothered to do, and that he shared what little he had, a portion of his own meager rations, whenever he saw someone else needed it more than he did. Dobbs, however, didn't let his guard down for a single day. Every morning when assigning the day's tasks in the gray light before the heat became unbearable, he gave Josiah the hardest jobs, clearing the rockiest ground, hauling the heaviest loads, working the row nearest the creek where copperheads liked to sun themselves on the banks, as though testing him, waiting for the moment he would finally break or answer back with the insolence Dobbs seemed almost eager to punish. But Josiah carried out every task assigned to him without complaint, with the same serene, unshakable dignity he had shown from the very first moment at the auction block. And slowly, almost against his own will, Dobbs found himself running out of pretexts. The weeks that followed established a rhythm of careful mutual observation between Margaret and the man she now legally owned, though she had already begun, in the privacy of her own thoughts, to feel the word owned sit wrong in her mouth, like a shoe on the wrong foot. Josiah worked the fields from before dawn, learning the particular rhythms of cotton cultivation on this soil with a speed that surprised even the workers who had spent years in these same rows. Within a week, he was pruning and thinning with the same practiced skill as men who had a decade more experience than he did. But Margaret noticed other things, too, small things she wasn't sure anyone else was watching closely enough to see. When Dobbs wasn't near, Josiah helped the older workers with their heaviest loads without being asked, shared water from his own dwindling ration with whoever needed it more, even when he himself was staggering with exhaustion by the day's end. And in the late afternoons, in the brief window between the end of fieldwork and the ringing of the supper bell, when he clearly believed no one of consequence was watching, he sat beneath the wide-spreading oak near the edge of the cotton rows with a handful of the plantation's youngest workers, teenagers no younger than 13 and no older than 16, who had grown up in bondage without ever once being taught their letters, and helped them work through sums on their fingers and shape words. In the dirt with sticks, patiently, over and over, as though he had all the time in the world despite having almost none. She watched him from her bedroom window one such afternoon, hidden behind the curtain like a guilty spy caught in her own house, watching the infinite patience with which he explained a concept for the third or fourth time to a young worker who kept forgetting, watching the way his eyes lit with something close to joy when one of them finally traced a word correctly and looked up at him for approval. That man, the one the trader had called Trouble, the one Dobbs still eyed like a loaded gun left carelessly on a table, had more humanity in that single unguarded gesture than many of the respectable church-going men Margaret had spent her whole life being introduced to at dinner parties and cotillions. One afternoon, driven by something she still couldn't fully name, she decided to approach in person, under the thin pretext of checking on the harvest's progress herself rather than waiting for Dobbs's evening report. She found Josiah sitting beneath the same oak, surrounded by the same small circle of young workers tracing clumsy letters into the red dirt with improvised sticks. When they saw her approaching across the field, they jumped to their feet immediately, scattering half a step back, their faces suddenly frightened, as though bracing for a punishment they'd learned somewhere along the short course of their young lives to expect from any unexpected approach by the mistress of the house. "Continue," Margaret said, surprising herself with the gentleness of her own voice. "I won't punish anyone for learning." They looked to Josiah, uncertain, and he gave them a small nod. Slowly, cautiously, they settled back down into the dirt, though their letters came out shakier than before, self-conscious under her gaze. Josiah looked up at Margaret with an expression that combined surprise and something like relief, an expression she would come to recognize over the following months as one of the truest things about him, his constant quiet astonishment at any small kindness the world offered him, as though he had trained himself never to expect it, and yet never quite managed to stop hoping for it either. "I teach them what I can in the little time we have, ma'am," he said. "I know it's not rightly my place." "It's exactly your place, if that's what you choose to do with the little free time you're given," Margaret answered. "Knowledge shouldn't be a privilege reserved only for those born to the right family." She surprised herself with the words even as she said them, and she saw something shift in Josiah's face, not quite a smile, but the shadow of one, held carefully in check. That afternoon she stayed far longer than she had planned or intended, watching Josiah patiently correct the way a young worker named Ruth traced the letter A, sounding it out again and again in his low, patient voice until she finally managed it correctly and beamed up at him with an unguarded pride that made something ache in Margaret's chest. Something about that small, ordinary scene, a man teaching a girl her letters beneath a tree on stolen time, at real risk to himself if Dobbs or anyone else decided to make trouble of it, finally convinced her, in a way the auction block and the trader's warning never had, that the man standing before her bore no real resemblance to the troublemaker the market had tried to sell her. Almost a month after the purchase, on an evening thick with the smell of rain that never quite arrived, she called him up to the big house. Dobbs protested with real vehemence when he heard of it, warning her that it was dangerous, unnatural even, to let a slave inside the main house to sit with the mistress as though he were a guest rather than property. But Margaret used a tone she had learned in these past weeks admitted no further argument. Josiah arrived at the back door with his shirt mended but clean, his hair still damp, as though he had washed carefully in the creek before making the walk up to the house. Charity, Margaret's lady's maid, a woman in her 50s who had served the Ashworth family since before Margaret was born, let him in with visible reluctance and an expression that promised a private word with her mistress later. Margaret received him in the library, her favorite room in the whole house, lined floor to ceiling with the books her father had collected over a lifetime, convinced, unusually for a man of his time and place, that his daughter deserved an education nearly as thorough as a son's, even if the wider world would never let her use it for much beyond conversation at dinner parties. "Dobbs says you caused trouble," she began, settling into the chair behind her father's old desk and watching Josiah closely as he remained standing near the door, uncertain whether he was meant to sit. "Dobbs considers me trouble because I question orders that put the other workers at real risk of harm," Josiah answered without hesitation and without apology in his voice. "Yesterday he had us working straight through the worst heat of the afternoon without water brought round. 2 of the older men nearly went down in the row. I stopped the work myself until water was fetched." Margaret leaned back in her chair, studying him in the lamplight, noticing again the particular quality in him that had first stopped her at the auction, not defiance exactly, something steadier and harder to name. "Can you read?" she asked, the question arriving almost before she decided to ask it. The question caught him visibly off guard. He hesitated for a long moment, clearly weighing whether it was safe to admit such a thing to a woman who, whatever kindness she'd shown so far, still legally held the power to have him whipped, sold, or worse for the wrong answer. Finally, something in her face must have decided it for him, because he chose to trust the truth. "Yes, ma'am." "Who taught you?" "A previous owner's daughter, back in Georgia. I was just a boy then. She taught me in secret with old books her family meant to throw out or give away. When her father found out what she'd done, he sold my mother off to another owner within the month to teach us both a lesson about knowing our place. I never saw my mother again." The pain in his voice was evident even through the careful control with which he spoke it, a wound clearly handled many times before, worn smooth at the edges, but never healed. Margaret felt something tight and hard in her chest. She rose without quite deciding to, crossed to the shelves, and pulled down a slim volume of poetry, offering it to him without another word. "Read this." Josiah opened the volume with careful, almost reverent hands, as though he were holding something dangerous and sacred at the same time. He began to read aloud, his voice clear and measured without a single stumble, with a comprehension of the rhythm and meaning of the words that went well beyond simple literacy. Margaret felt something stir inside her that she recognized distantly and with real alarm as dangerous. "Why did your other owners sell you on?" she asked when he had finished and closed the book gently, still holding it as though reluctant to let it go. "The first because his wife discovered I understood accounts better than her husband did. It shamed him in front of his business partners, having a slave correct his figures. The second because I told him in front of his own dinner guests, which he never forgave, that he was mistreating a young girl he owned over nothing more than a broken plate. The third," he paused, and Margaret watched something darker cross his face. I refused to whip another man for stealing food to feed his sick child. I took the lashes meant for both of us instead. After that, he sold me off, telling the trader I set a bad example for the others. And it doesn't frighten you that I might do the very same, sell you, punish you, for what Dobbs calls insubordination. Nothing much frightens me anymore, ma'am. I've come to understand that dignity carries a price, and I've decided I'm willing to pay it, whatever that price turns out to be. Margaret sat in silence for a long while after that, studying him across the lamplit room, feeling the whole shape of her carefully ordered life beginning, almost imperceptibly, to tilt. Finally, she made a decision that would, though she couldn't have known it yet, change both their lives entirely. I want you to keep the plantation's account books, she said. They've been in disarray since my husband died. Dobbs can scarcely add a column of figures. Can you manage it? For the first time since she'd known him, she watched genuine surprise crack the careful composure Josiah wore like armor. You're offering me clerk's work. Ledger work. I'm offering you the chance to use your mind as well as your back, since it seems a waste to keep the one locked away while working the other half to exhaustion. You'll keep to the fields in the mornings, so as not to raise Dobbs's suspicions any further than they already run, but your afternoons you'll spend here helping me set the books and the correspondence to rights. I can do it, ma'am, and I'll do it well. You have my word on it. When he finally left the library that evening, walking back down toward the cabins under a sky just beginning to show stars, Margaret realized her hands were trembling faintly against the desk. She had just made a decision that would scandalize every family in the county if word of it ever got out properly. But there was something in that man, some quality of unbroken dignity she had never once encountered in the comfortable, complacent men of her own society, that pushed her steadily toward risks she would never a year before have thought herself capable of taking. The days that followed the library conversation established a routine that both Margaret and Josiah navigated with a caution that grew more difficult to sustain with each passing week. Josiah worked the fields from before dawn until the sun stood directly overhead, gradually earning something like grudging respect from workers who had watched him prove himself row after row, task after task, without a single misstep Dobbs could seize upon. Then in the hottest hours of the afternoon, when even Dobbs preferred to retreat to the shade of the tool shed rather than stand in the sun policing men who had already proven they didn't need policing, Josiah climbed the rise to the big house, where Margaret waited in the library with the ledgers and the tangled correspondence her husband had left behind, like a puzzle designed to punish her. She soon discovered she had been right to trust her instinct about him. Josiah didn't merely understand numbers, he understood the shape of an economy, the way cotton moved from field to gin to broker to port, the way a man with the right knowledge could see 3 steps ahead of one without it. Your husband sold most seasons to the same middleman in Charleston, he told her one afternoon, laying out a set of figures he'd copied onto a fresh sheet, his handwriting neat and small, economical with the paper he'd been given. Here he sold at 8 cents a pound at the gin. The broker turned around and sold the same cotton at the port for nearly 14. If you dealt directly with the export houses instead of letting a middleman skim the difference, you could see your income rise considerably, perhaps as much as a third, once you account for what you'd save in commission. How is it you know so much about markets and port prices? Margaret asked, genuinely startled, turning the pages back and forth as though she might find the answer written somewhere in the margins. On the plantation where I was born, the owner had a partner who handled all the export dealings. I carried messages back and forth between them for years, starting when I was young enough that no one thought twice about what a boy might overhear. Nobody guards their tongue around an enslaved child carrying a letter from one room to the next. They talked business freely in front of me, never imagining I understood a word of it, let alone remembered the figures. I listened. I studied the numbers whenever they left papers lying carelessly on a desk. Margaret studied the calculations laid out before her, tracing the columns with one finger. He was right, as he always seemed to be, in that quiet, unassuming way that never once demanded credit for being right. Why do you help me so thoroughly? She asked, looking up at him. Why not simply do the bare minimum required of you and no more? Josiah looked up from the ledger, and for a moment their eyes held across the narrow space between the desk and his chair, an intensity passing between them that made Margaret's pulse quicken in a way she immediately distrusted. "Because you treat me as a man, ma'am, not as a tool that happens to speak. You're the first person in years who has thought to ask me what I think about anything at all. You gave me water on the road back from Charleston when you had no obligation to do so. That alone is more than most enslaved people receive in the whole course of their lives." Something in his voice, in the steadiness with which he held her gaze, sent heat rushing to Margaret's cheeks. She stood abruptly, smoothing her skirts, suddenly unable to remain seated so close to him. "I think that will be enough for today." But that night, lying awake in the wide bed she had shared so briefly and so unhappily with Cornelius, she found she could not stop turning his words over in her mind, the sharp, careful intelligence behind his eyes, the dignity with which he carried invisible chains she was beginning to understand were far heavier than any iron ever forged. She knew with the clear-eyed honesty she reserved for her most private hours that she was cultivating feelings that were dangerous, forbidden, feelings that would unravel everything her society considered proper for a widow of her station. Over the following weeks their conversations expanded well beyond the necessary business of the ledgers. What began as discussions of cotton prices and shipping contracts drifted, almost without either of them steering it there deliberately, into talk of books, of ideas, of the kind of impossible futures neither of them had any business imagining together. Margaret discovered that Josiah had read far more than she could have guessed from a man who'd spent his whole life in bondage, that he held considered opinions on philosophy and government that would have held their own at any dinner table in Charleston, had anyone there been willing to hear them from his mouth. One humid afternoon, while sorting through a recent shipment of books Margaret had ordered from a bookseller in the city, Josiah lifted a slim volume of Rousseau from the crate with careful, almost reverent hands, turning it over as though greeting an old acquaintance in an unexpected place. "My second owner kept this very book on his shelf," he said, leafing through the worn pages slowly. "He never once read it himself. He kept it there to impress the men who came to dine with him, propped where visitors would see the spine. I read it in secret, a page or two at a time, whenever he was called away on business and the house sat quiet." "And what did you make of his ideas about the natural liberty of men?" "I think it a bitter irony, ma'am, that a country which declared its independence quoting those very ideas keeps 500,000 souls, more even, chained within its own borders. Mr. Jefferson himself wrote of rights no government could rightly take from a man. And yet here I stand, 2 generations later, still waiting on mine." "The northern states have begun striking down slavery altogether," Margaret offered, though even as she said it, the words tasted thin and unconvincing in her own mouth. "On paper, in the north, ma'am. Here in the south, it stands stronger than it has ever stood, propped up by law, by cotton, by every institution this state has built to protect it. Laws change slower than the hearts of the men who profit from the injustice those laws protect." Margaret fell silent, feeling the full weight of his words settle over her like a physical thing. She had grown up hearing from her father, from her tutors, from every pulpit she had ever sat beneath, that slavery was simply how the world was ordered, an unquestionable fact of nature passed down from one generation to the next like the color of a person's eyes. But Josiah's words, delivered with the calm of a man who had lived the injustice in his own flesh rather than merely observed it from a comfortable distance, had begun quietly cracking those inherited certainties, one conversation at a time. "How do you manage to keep any hope at all?" she asked finally, "after everything you've endured?" "Because the alternative is despair, ma'am, and despair is precisely what every one of my former owners wanted me to feel. Refusing to surrender hope is in itself an act of resistance, perhaps the only one available to a man in my position, but a real one all the same." That conversation lodged itself in Margaret's mind for days afterward, resurfacing while she reviewed the ledgers alone in the evenings, while she walked the narrow paths between the cotton rows watching the bolls swell toward harvest, while she lay sleepless in a house that felt with each passing week less and less empty, thanks entirely to the stolen afternoons she now spent with a man the law considered her property. One evening in late August, a storm rolled in off the coast with startling suddenness, the sky purpling and splitting with lightning while wind lashed rain against the library windows hard enough to rattle the panes in their frames. Josiah had stayed later than usual to finish a set of correspondence, and neither of them made any move to end the evening despite the storm, despite the lateness of the hour, despite every reasonable argument for retreating to their separate corners of an unequal world. "What would you do?" Margaret asked into the charged quiet between claps of thunder. "If you woke tomorrow and found yourself free, if every chain simply vanished overnight, what would you make of your life?" Josiah set down his pen and looked at her steadily, the lamplight catching the planes of his face. "I'd study, first of all, find whatever means I could to learn more than I already know. Law, perhaps, or medicine, something that might let me do real good in the world rather than simply survive it. I'd try to help others like myself find their own voice, their own dignity, wherever the world had tried hardest to strip it from them. I'd devote whatever years I had left to that work. Those are dangerous dreams to carry. The only dreams worth having are the dangerous kind, ma'am. A safe dream isn't truly a dream at all, it's only a wish too small to threaten anything, and therefore too small to matter." Margaret rose and crossed to the window, watching rain streak the dark glass, feeling the storm outside as a kind of mirror for the one gathering inside her own chest. "My father used to tell me slavery was a necessary evil, the price of prosperity in a hard land. My husband believed precisely the same, and never once in all our years married did he trouble himself to question it. But I look at men and women in chains for no crime beyond the color God gave their skin, and I find myself asking, what manner of world permits such an arrangement to stand unquestioned? Injustice doesn't come down from God, ma'am. It's made by men who choose to build it, and sustained by men who choose to profit from it, generation after generation." They looked at each other across the stormlit room, the air between them charged with something that had nothing to do with the weather outside, and Margaret understood with a clarity that frightened her that they stood now at the edge of something from which there would be no quiet retreat. The weeks following the storm became a careful, agonizing dance of closeness and distance, neither of them willing to name plainly what had grown between them, though both felt it in every lingering glance across the library desk, in every silence that no longer sat awkwardly between them but instead felt charged with something sweet and perilous in equal measure. Margaret began inventing reasons, thin as they sometimes were, to keep Josiah in the house longer than strictly necessary, correspondence that didn't truly need his review, opinions she solicited on books she had already finished reading alone the night before. And Josiah, with the patience of a man who had spent his entire life learning to wait, answered every flimsy pretext with the same quiet devotion, perhaps understanding better than she did herself how badly she needed those stolen hours. One night, working past what either of them would have called a reasonable hour to prepare shipping documents for a new buyer in Charleston, Margaret leaned across the desk to point out an error in a column of figures, and her hand brushed against his. Neither of them pulled away. "Margaret," he said, her given name unadorned by any title for the first time, his voice dropping to barely more than a whisper. She didn't correct him. Instead, she lifted her eyes and found his own waiting at a distance that had grown dangerously small. "What is it we're doing, Josiah?" Acknowledging a truth we've both been avoiding for weeks now, he answered without looking away. "But I cannot take the next step, Margaret. Not while the imbalance between us remains so complete. You own me. Whatever happens from here must be entirely your choosing, or it means nothing at all, worse than nothing." Margaret felt hot tears gathering unbidden in her eyes. The particular nobility of the man, the way he guarded her right to choose even while every ounce of desire in the room ran mutual and plain between them, moved her more deeply than any grand romantic gesture ever could have. "And if I told you I wished to know you not as property I hold, but as the man you actually are? Then I would tell you that's impossible so long as I wear chains, whether or not you can see them. There is no true love to be found where there is no true freedom standing beneath it." The word love, once spoken, hung suspended in the room like the afterimage of a lightning strike. Margaret extended her hand across the narrow space, trembling, and after a long moment's hesitation, Josiah took it. Their fingers wove together, and for the first time in her adult life, Margaret felt she was touching something entirely real, something that mattered more than every rule of conduct she had observed so meticulously since girlhood. "Then I will see you freed," she whispered. "I'll grant it. And after that, you may choose freely whether to stay or go, to love me or not, but the choice will be yours alone, never an obligation laid on you by the accident of who happens to own the paper that says you belong to them. Josiah closed his eyes as though her words caused him physical pain. Do you understand what that would cost you? Your reputation destroyed beyond repair. Society here would never forgive it. I've spent the whole of my life doing precisely what was expected of me, Margaret said, a conviction rising in her voice that surprised even her. I married the man I was told to marry. I smiled exactly when I was instructed to smile. I am tired, Josiah, tired down to my bones of living a life I never once chose for myself. In the days that followed, they began to plan with the particular careful desperation of people who understand exactly how much they stand to lose. Margaret discreetly wrote to a lawyer in Charleston, a man named Elias Cobb, known quietly among certain circles for his willingness to take on causes other men of his profession preferred to avoid. He explained in a letter that arrived sealed and unmarked that manumission by private petition, though technically still legal in South Carolina, had grown steadily more restricted with each passing decade, and that success was far from guaranteed. Margaret pursued it regardless, filing the petition through Cobb's careful maneuvering, leaning on her family's standing and on the plain, undeniable fact that Josiah's management had already saved the plantation from ruin, a business justification, she hoped, that might carry the petition through committee without inviting the far greater scandal a personal one would summon down on her immediately. Word of the petition spread through the county regardless, moving faster than either of them had anticipated, the way any unusual request always did in a society with little else to occupy its gossip. Margaret found herself facing a steady stream of uninvited visitors, each one disguising naked curiosity as polite concern for her welfare. The women of her circle grew audibly quieter whenever she passed them after Sunday services. Their fans lifted just enough to hide their mouths, but not their eyes. Dobbs proved the hardest to manage of all. One afternoon he confronted her directly in the yard in front of half a dozen workers, his voice pitched deliberately loud enough to carry. This isn't right, Mrs. Ashworth. That man has entirely too much influence over you these days. People are talking, and they're not saying anything kind. Let them talk to their heart's content, Margaret answered, drawing herself up to her full height. Josiah has helped nearly triple this plantation's profits within a matter of months. The figures don't lie, Dobbs, whatever the gossips choose to say. This isn't only about figures, ma'am. It's about how things are meant to be ordered. A man like him has no business inside the big house, working so close beside you. It isn't natural, and you know it isn't. What isn't natural, Dobbs, is chaining a human being for no crime beyond the color of the skin he was born wearing. Now, unless you have something more useful to occupy yourself with, I have work waiting. Weeks later, Cobb's letter arrived bearing devastating news. The legislative committee had rejected the manumission petition outright, citing the statute's demand that any such petition demonstrate service, extraordinary and meritorious beyond the ordinary run of a plantation's affairs, a bar the committee, composed largely of planters wary of setting any precedent that might embolden their own enslaved workers to expect similar treatment, judged Margaret's petition had failed to clear. Josiah legally remained her property. Before continuing, it's worth pausing to understand the real legal landscape underlying this story. Manumission, an owner's act of freeing an enslaved person, grew increasingly restricted across the Antebellum South as the decades wore on, particularly after Nat Turner's 1831 rebellion in Virginia intensified white fears of black autonomy throughout the region. South Carolina had passed a statute in 1820 that placed the right of manumission solely in the hands of the state legislature, ending the older practice of private manumission by an owner's own decision. Other states, including Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi, passed similar laws requiring legislative approval for individual manumissions, effectively placing the decision far outside any single slaveholder's private authority. By the 1850s, several states had banned manumission almost entirely, forcing owners who wished to free enslaved people to send them out of state or leave them in a dangerous legal limbo with no recognized status at all. Even where manumission succeeded, free black people faced severe restrictions on movement, employment, and legal testimony. And many states required freed individuals to leave within a set period or face re-enslavement by law. Interracial marriage was illegal throughout the antebellum South. And children born to an enslaved mother were automatically born enslaved themselves regardless of the father's race or legal status, a principle known as parta sequitur ventrem, inherited directly from English common law and enshrined across nearly every Southern legal code. These realities made the union Margaret and Josiah sought, legitimized by law, acknowledged publicly, blessed by any recognized church, extraordinarily dangerous and, in the strict eyes of the law, nearly impossible to achieve. It was precisely this impossibility that the two of them now chose deliberately and at enormous risk to defy. Then we find another way, he told her when she brought him the letter, his jaw set with the same quiet, unbroken resolve she had come to recognize as fundamental to who he was. Or we take what happiness the world still permits us to steal, and we go on from there. The months that followed were, against every reasonable expectation of the world surrounding them, among the happiest either of them had ever known. They met each night in the library long after the household staff had retired and the plantation lay dark and quiet around them, speaking of futures that remained, by every law of the land, impossible, a life where they might one day walk together beneath open daylight without fear of what eyes might see. Then, a month into that fragile happiness, Margaret noticed her body beginning to change. The morning sickness arrived subtly at first, then intensified until there was no denying what it meant. When the full weight of the realization finally settled over her, she felt the ground open beneath her feet in a way no legislative rejection ever had. She was carrying his child. She told no one for several days, paralyzed by a fear more complete than any she had yet felt in this whole unfolding drama. She understood precisely what discovery would mean, living, undeniable proof of a union her entire society would call an abomination, evidence a widow could neither hide nor explain away with any polite fiction. Finally, one night, unable to carry the secret alone any longer, she told him. "Josiah, I have to tell you something." He came to her side immediately, noticing the tremor in her voice. "I'm carrying a child." "Yours." The silence that followed felt endless. Margaret searched his face for fear, for regret, for any sign that he too felt the world crumbling beneath them both. Instead, she found something entirely unexpected, an expression of pure astonishment bordering on reverence. "Are you certain?" "Yes. I've felt it for weeks now, and I can no longer pretend otherwise, even to myself." Josiah took both her hands in his eyes bright with an emotion visibly fighting against the enormous weight of what this meant for them both. "Margaret, this is a wonder beyond anything I ever let myself hope for. But I understand too exactly what danger it places you in." "I know. I don't yet know what we're going to do about it." For the first weeks she attempted to conceal the changes in her body beneath ever more elaborate arrangements of fabric, sending her regrets to social gatherings with vague excuses about delicate health following her long mourning. But a body in the end cannot be made to lie forever, and time, which had felt like an ally in those first stolen months, became instead her cruelest enemy, closing in with each week that passed. Her lady's maid, Charity, who had served the Ashworth family since before Margaret was born, found her weeping quietly in her bedroom late one afternoon, and would not be turned away with excuses. "Mrs. Ashworth, forgive my boldness, but I've spent weeks now watching you try to hide something I've already seen plain as day. I'm neither blind nor foolish, and I won't pretend otherwise to spare either of our feelings." Margaret felt her heart seize entirely still. "Charity, you needn't explain a single thing to me, child. I watched you grow from a babe in this very house. I know full well your marriage to Mr. Ashworth held no true love in it, not on either side. And I have eyes enough to see how that man looks at you, and how you look right back at him. I ask only that you take care. This world will show no kindness toward this truth once it surfaces, and surface it will, sooner rather than later, however long we manage to hold it off. You will never betray what you've seen?" Margaret asked, gripping Charity's rough, work-worn hands. "Never in this life. But prepare yourself, my girl. Prepare for what's surely coming, because it is coming, no matter how long the two of you managed to postpone it. The perfect moment never arrived. The truth came instead in the cruelest way possible, publicly, without warning, without any chance for Margaret to control how it was revealed. It happened on a Sunday nearly 4 months after that first night in the library, when her belly could no longer be concealed beneath any cut of fabric the seamstress devised, however cleverly draped. She walked into the church with her head held high, as she always had, but this time she felt the stares fix on her differently, sharper, colder, hungrier for scandal than they had ever been, even in the weeks after Cornelius's death. The murmuring started at the back pews and rolled forward like a wave breaking against the shore. Women leaned toward each other, fans lifted just enough to hide their mouths, but nothing else. Men watched her with a mixture of open curiosity and something closer to disgust than she had ever felt directed at her in her entire life. Reverend Thaddeus Whitmore, who had baptized her as an infant in this very building, stopped her at the church door after the service in full view of the departing congregation. "Mrs. Ashworth," he said, his voice pitched to Carrie, "there are serious rumors circulating about your conduct. Your present condition seems regrettably to confirm them beyond any reasonable doubt." The silence that followed was absolute. It felt as though the whole county held its breath, waiting to see whether she would collapse or answer. "I have nothing to confess to you in this churchyard, Reverend," she said, though her voice trembled despite every effort to steady it. "Whatever confession is owed, I will make privately, as is proper." But the damage had already been done, spreading through the county faster than any letter could travel. By nightfall, everyone knew, or believed they knew, the whole shameful shape of it: a respectable widow, visibly pregnant without a husband, living on a plantation where her manager, her closest companion, by every account whispered from kitchen to parlor, had been mere months earlier a slave bought at auction. The consequences arrived with brutal speed. Invitations ceased entirely within a week. Merchants who had bought her cotton for years suddenly found excuses to delay contracts, then to break them outright. Women who had once called for afternoon tea now crossed the street rather than pass within speaking distance. Her late husband's brother, Nathaniel Ashworth, arrived at the plantation only days later, flanked by 2 men carrying legal papers, wearing an expression of barely concealed triumph beneath a mask of false sympathy. "Margaret," he said, "I've come to offer you a way out of this disgrace. I'll buy the plantation outright. You can retreat somewhere quiet, far from prying eyes, and settle your situation with whatever privacy still remains available to you. The plantation is not for sale, Nathaniel. Don't be a fool. You've lost every ounce of credibility in this county, and if you refuse my offer, I'll use my connections to question your fitness to manage my brother's estate at all. A woman in your condition, behaving as scandalously as you have, certainly suggests instability of mind." "Instability?" Margaret repeated, feeling fury steadily replace the fear that had gripped her since Sunday. "I have nearly tripled this plantation's profits since inheriting it. I have paid off debts your brother left behind, debts you likely knew of and never once warned me about. If anyone here has shown poor judgment, Nathaniel, it was not I." Josiah, who had been listening from the doorway, stepped inside calmly, though his voice carried an edge that cut straight through the tension in the room. "Mr. Ashworth, if you pursue this further, we will make public the correspondence we found between your brother and merchants who evaded customs duties for years running. Mrs. Ashworth has been discreet about her late husband's dealings out of respect for his memory. That discretion has limits." Nathaniel's face reddened with fury, but after a long, calculating pause, he withdrew, promising in a voice low enough that only Margaret and Josiah heard it that this was far from finished. It was, in the end, an empty threat. Whatever influence he had hoped to use against her withered once word of his own brother's smuggling began to circulate in the same drawing rooms that had so recently condemned her. And within the season, Nathaniel Ashworth quietly stopped calling at Ashworth Hollow altogether. That night Margaret finally allowed herself to collapse, trembling, into Josiah's arms. "It's over, Josiah. My reputation, my place in this world, all of it gone. Then let us face what remains together, without further secrets," he answered, holding her steady. "There is nothing left to hide. The world already knows the truth of it. All that remains is deciding how we intend to meet it. Josiah proposed marriage days later, the one thing neither of them had dared consider openly until the world had already taken everything else from them. "Marry me, Margaret." She looked at him, startled despite everything they had already survived together. "You know the law would never permit it. I am still, in the eyes of every court in this state, your owner, whatever we intend privately between ourselves." "Then we petition again," he said, firm and unhurried, formally, publicly this time, with nothing left to hide that hasn't already been dragged into the light. "We have nothing further to lose and everything to gain, legitimacy for our child, a name that means something, an honest future in place of one lived always in the shadows." The path forward was narrow and dangerous in equal measure. A second manumission petition filed openly this time, naming the child soon to be born, appealing to whatever thin sympathy still remained among the county's more moderate men. And should that fail, as Cobb warned them plainly it very well might, a desperate alternative Josiah raised only with great reluctance, fleeing north together before the child came, abandoning the plantation, abandoning everything Margaret had fought so hard to save, in exchange for a freedom South Carolina's laws would never grant them within its own borders. Margaret chose to fight first through the courts, through every careful maneuver Cobb could devise, through whatever standing her family's name still carried despite the scandal now attached permanently to it. The second petition took months to work its way through the legislature, months during which the household endured mounting isolation, during which Dobbs finally resigned in open disgust rather than continue serving under what he called an unnatural arrangement, and during which Charity remained steadfastly at Margaret's side, stitching baby clothes by candlelight and telling anyone bold enough to ask that her mistress's condition was the Lord's business and none of yours. The child, a boy, was born in January during a rare snowfall that dusted the cotton fields white and hushed the whole plantation into an unfamiliar silence. The labor was long and difficult, and Josiah refused every convention that dictated a husband, or whatever he was permitted to call himself, should wait outside the room, remaining instead at Margaret's side through every contraction despite the midwife's repeated protests. When the infant's first cry finally broke the tension in that room, Margaret felt months of accumulated suffering dissolve entirely against the small, impossible weight placed in her arms. 3 weeks later, word arrived at last from the state capital. The second petition had passed, narrowly, on the strength of testimony from merchants whose fortunes Josiah's management had quietly enriched, and on the reasoning of a sympathetic judge persuaded by Cobb's careful argument that the newborn child constituted a matter of settled family property. The legislature had a practical interest in resolving cleanly before it became a public embarrassment dragging on indefinitely. Josiah was declared at last a free man. It was not a marriage South Carolina law would ever recognize, no southern state permitted a union across the color line, and this story takes real dramatic license in imagining a quiet ceremony performed in a neighboring county by a sympathetic minister willing to risk his own standing, unrecorded by any court, yet held sacred nonetheless by the two people who stood before him and meant every word they spoke. Before the story's conclusion, it's worth understanding the real conditions free black people faced across the antebellum South. Josiah's freedom, however hard-won, granted him neither equality nor true safety. Free black Southerners occupied an extremely precarious legal category throughout this period, often required to carry documented proof of their free status at all times or risk being seized and sold back into slavery on the strength of a stranger's accusation alone. States including South Carolina, Alabama, and Louisiana restricted free black residents from testifying against white citizens in court, from owning firearms, from gathering in groups without white supervision, and in many cases required annual registration with local courts or expulsion from the state entirely. In South Carolina specifically, free black people never exceeded roughly 2% of the state's total black population throughout the antebellum era, one of the lowest such proportions anywhere in the South, a reflection of just how difficult and how rare successful manumission had become there by the mid-19th century. Interracial couples, even where one partner achieved legal freedom, lived under the constant threat of violence, social exile, and frequently forced separation, since no Southern state recognized their bond under any law. The story of Margaret and Josiah, dramatized here with a resolution history rarely permitted in reality, nonetheless reflects the genuine courage of countless real individuals, enslaved and free alike, who risked everything they had for love and dignity within a system explicitly built to deny both to them. Margaret and Josiah remained at Ashworth Hollow in the years that followed, never fully welcomed back into Charleston society, many doors closed to them permanently, but building against every expectation of a cruel and unjust world a family no rumor and no judgment could ever fully undo. They named their son Ezekiel, a name carrying no other man's history, so that he might write his own from the very first page. And on quiet evenings, when the cotton swayed gently under the Carolina breeze, Margaret would sometimes think back to that scorching July morning in the Charleston market, when her eyes first met the eyes of a man in chains who refused to look away, and she understood, with a clarity that never dimmed with time, that everything which followed, every hardship and every fragile joy, had begun in that single unflinching glance.